All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Can everybody hear me and see my screen? I should ask first.
Yes.
Yep.
All right.
Yes.
So welcome to AKS office hours this week. So Kendall and I both run office hours. Kendall, I don't know if she'll be with us today. She was on, I believe, vacation this week. So my name's Dave Strabel. I work at Microsoft as a cloud native architect on our global black belt team. If you want to connect with me, I am at Dave_Strabel on Twitter. Also recently authored a Kubernetes best practices book with Brendan Burns and Lachlan Evanson. And Kendall is also one of the hosts for the Azure podcast, and you can connect with her at Kendall Roden on Twitter. So those of you new to office hours, why do we do AKS office hours? It's really to provide AKS customers with updates pertaining to AKS and the cloud native ecosystem. So some of our topics will be specifically around AKS and other first-party Microsoft services you may use in conjunction with AKS, but we'll also cover other open source projects within the cloud native ecosystem. Typically, our agenda goes with a short talk/demo on cloud native technologies and how they relate to Kubernetes and AKS, and is also to collect feedback from our customers, issues, blockers, use cases, and really any questions that you may have in your usage of AKS and some of these other services you may use. So what you can expect, the first 5 to 10 minutes is a welcome, and then we'll provide a short thing on AKS and ecosystem updates. And then we will do a talk/demo. Today we have a team that'll be talking about GitOps. And usually at the end, we try to leave some time for Ask Us Anything. A lot of times we don't make it to that, but feel free to ask questions also in the chat on questions you may have on AKS. We have a lot of people from Microsoft on the call, so a lot of different people to answer your questions. Just keep in mind that we do want two-way interaction, but please stay on mute when you are not speaking. There's also a little, like in Teams at the very top, there's a little hand with a smiley face. If you want to raise your hand, that sometimes also helps. So we're not talking over each other. The office hours is primarily hosted by the GBB team, but we have a lot of support from other teams within Microsoft and support from the product group for AKS and other services within Azure. All the recordings and content will be posted post-call, so you can always get those recorded sessions if you miss a session. If you want to rewatch it, we do post those to our YouTube channel. You can also reach out to us anytime if you have thoughts, ideas, questions, even if you want to present on what you're doing with Kubernetes. That's always great. So feel free to reach out to us at aksofficehours@microsoft.com. All right, so AKS updates. Max Surge upgrades are now GA. So what that is, if you are going to do, say, a node pool upgrade, previous behavior, it always went upgrade, we'll add a node, upgrade one node. Once that comes back up, move on to the next node. This can take a long time in large node pools. So now you can set a max surge, so I can say, hey, upgrade 5 nodes at a time. Ephemeral OS is now also generally available, and you will notice from now on the Ephemeral OS will be the default for VMs that support it. Meaning there's going to be some VM types out there that do not have the capacity in the Ephemeral OS to support it. So you want to make sure that you are using a VM type that does support Ephemeral OS. This feature definitely helps with a lot of stability within the cluster. Previously, you may have stability issues if you started running into disk queuing. The ephemeral OS should solve most of those issues for you if you were experiencing those. Containerd is now also GA, and it will be the default container runtime for clusters created or upgraded to Kubernetes version 1.19. So this does remove the full Docker stack that we used previously as the runtime. So we will be utilizing Containerd going forward. The max surge upgrades, I already talked about, had that in here twice for some reason. Also, the AKS image now aligns to the Microsoft security baseline that conforms to Linux and Kubernetes benchmarks for CIS and hardened images. You can find more on what this means in our AKS docs. If you just do a Google search for AKS hardened images, it will link you to that doc for this update. And as always, I like to mention, especially people new to the call, is that we do publish our AKS roadmap publicly on GitHub, aka.ms/AKS/roadmap. And you can find a detailed roadmap of everything from GA to things that are in preview, things that are in development, and even things that are in our backlog. It is updated continually, so you will see new features, and as they move across from like things from development to preview to GA. Ecosystem updates, just a couple things here. Kuma went to 1.0, a lot of new features and improvements. If you're not familiar with Kuma, it is a service mesh that was developed by Kong and donated to the CNCF. So they just had a very big GA release with their 1.0. Another thing a lot of people are talking about is Kubernetes deprecating Docker as a container runtime after version 1.20. A lot of people have a lot of questions and I guess concerns around this. Majority of providers have moved to Containerd, as you have seen with our 1.19, and going forward we will be using Containerd. Really, Kubernetes supporting the full Docker stack. Containerd was broken out from the full Docker stack a long time ago, actually. The full Docker stack has a lot of like UX type stuff with dealing with Docker and wasn't supported by the Kubernetes container runtime interface. They actually built this little Docker shim in there. So that's what's being deprecated. So this really shouldn't be a big change for majority of users. That's not to say other users won't run into things depending on how they're utilizing their clusters. But this was kind of a long time coming. For those, using the full Docker stack there with their Kubernetes clusters, this is something you'll want to look at moving to a different container runtime. It will be deprecated as version 1.20, but it will still have, typically I think they support it after a year after they announce the deprecation. Kubernetes 1.20 will be released next week. So that will take, a few weeks and that to get into preview into AKS. If you're not familiar, we typically bring in new releases into AKS fairly quickly. They will be marked as a preview release till we move them to GA. So once a new version, say 1.19 goes GA, we will usually introduce something like 1.20. Once that goes GA, we typically introduce the next new version into preview. I probably should have had a link for this next one. The Cloud Native Security White Paper. The SIG Security Group developed a white paper around best practices around Kubernetes. So you can check that out. If you just go to the CNCF blog, it is one of the first announcements on there. Sorry, I'll put that in our show notes to have all the links that I did not put into this deck. The Kubernetes Security Specialist certification is now available. So if you are into the Kubernetes certifications, they have released the new security specialist certification. All right, that is all I have for updates. So I will hand it over and we will talk about GitOps.
Thank you, Dave. Andre, you want to share your screen?
Sure. Just a moment.
Yeah, while Andre is sharing his screen, I can do a quick intro. My name is Jhansi Reddy. I am a technical program manager from Microsoft and a team in Microsoft where we work with customers, Azure customers specifically. So the open source initiative that you are seeing with the GitOps observability, we have a code name for this. It's called Bedrock. And then the background on this project is that it came from the collective experience of us working with various customers of Azure. So the organization that Andre, I, and Samaya are part of, we do something called Code With engagement with customers. And we are in that process, we are helping them through their Kubernetes journey. So a lot of customers are trying to modernize their applications, kind of maybe going from monolithic applications to microservices, and they're needing a bit of help on how to get started and how do we operationalize this. So we started looking at what is the tooling that is required for our customers to efficiently operationalize. And then also the pattern that would fit the enterprise needs. So when we started talking to the customers, we also realized that there needs to be a workflow that fits the organization needs, right? So that's where this observability comes into place. The customers know their business very well. They know how their applications work, and what they needed help with was how do I operationalize this with Kubernetes, and then specifically with the GitOps and containers. They want to see the journey of the container as their code makes its way from the time the code is checked in until it lands in the cluster. So that is kind of a high-level overview. And I want to introduce my colleagues, Andre and Samia, if you want to take that away, Andre.
Hi, I'm Andre Briggs. I work here also in CSE at Microsoft, and yeah, have been working on sort of Kubernetes for the past couple of years here. Yeah, and helping customers as well. Thank you.
Yeah, Samia.
Hi, everyone. My name is Samia. I also work here at the CSE organization at Microsoft, and I've been working on Kubernetes related projects for the last year and a half or so.
Great. We move to the next slide, Andre. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll take it away from here. So just a quick introduction to GitOps. So GitOps is the idea that a version control system like Git can store all your code and configuration for a Kubernetes application. And it includes the use of automated operators such as Flux to sync changes to your cluster automatically. So here's a very simple diagram of what that would look like. Why is GitOps becoming popular? It's because it's simple, easy to understand. It works well because developers are very fluent in Git. It's also secure because access to a repository can be easily restricted. It's also easy to monitor because of the tracking that comes out of the box with Git. Next slide, please. So how do we define GitOps observability? In any real-world application, you will have a release, an observation, and you will have an orientation around what was released, and then you will make a decision around that. So we continue in that cycle. In GitOps observability here, we are concerned with the left side of this whole process, which is about your acting and releasing. It's crucial to know how long something takes to get to your cluster, how it gets there, what are the processes involved, and what are the various points of failure. And all of these are very important, and that's the area that we'll be focusing on here. In the industry, we've seen many challenges around this area. Complexity is introduced by more teams, more microservices, the need for flighting features. In any real-world application, teams will work in branches. Oftentimes, teams will want to go and deploy their branches before they go to the main production branch. When you have several teams working together and one team wants to do a rollback, it's very hard to understand a high-level view of what's going on in the architecture.
So next, I'm going to talk. Hello. Yeah. Next, I'll talk about a sort of initiative that we had started around our experiences with working with a lot of these Kubernetes workloads and attempting to do deployment with GitOps and also the observability around that. So the Bedrock project background. Yeah, it's essentially, it's a Git repository that we'll give you a link to, but it's our collective wisdom of working with customers. It's, kind of an opinionated view. And I'll say that the problem statements are, making sure that we can reliably and efficiently deploy infrastructure, service deployments, should be secure and auditable. You kind of get that for free. And yeah, something that fits your organizational needs. When folks are doing GitOps, you could be doing it as a solo developer, or you could be doing it as a large distributed team where every team has their own Kubernetes cluster. So, making sure that the workflow can fit those sorts of things. Of course, we don't want folks having to hand edit complex YAML files that can become quite difficult and error prone. And, usually there are different roles and actors within a deployment to Kubernetes. Sometimes you have a dev team and SREs, or maybe they're all in one, or maybe you have someone who is concerned with another piece of things. In the end, everyone needs to know what's going on. And, in the end, you just want to be able to deploy things repeatably and sort of get it down to a level where there's no more concern around deploying software to Kubernetes, that it's something that is very well described. So to start with Bedrock, we created some tooling to go and sort of help automate a lot of the GitOps pipelines that we were creating as working with customers. Every customer had something different, and we kind of looked at what we were doing with each customer, and sometimes just rolled it back into this repository. We also set up some hooks for observability to make sure that we can see what's going on, and from the point that you do a build with your software to go and create a container to the point it gets to the cluster. We call that a container journey. And also, a lot of folks come in with different ways they want to go and create infrastructure. For instance, if you're using Azure, you might want to use either Azure RM, or maybe you're going to use Bicep, which is something that's new, or you could use Terraform. And in the end, it's something that we want to just build on some engineering fundamentals. So let me cover a typical Bedrock scenario in terms of GitOps automation. One of the things that we did, is create a CLI, which just allows you, for instance, on Azure DevOps, to put in your organization name, your project name, some secret so that we can access to your Azure DevOps personal access token. And then we could basically go and create an entire GitOps, scaffold a GitOps end-to-end for you by going and creating a directory that you have your YAML files in, by going and installing Flux on an AKS cluster for you, going and handling all your secrets, having a Azure Key Vault, etc., all from a single command. And then also a second command down here to be able to see the observability of what you've just deployed. So this is a typical scenario. And after this, this is kind of what would be going on behind the scenes in this sort of prototypical experience. And of course, the previous command is kind of a on Rails version. but you can really break up these things and do it however is needed for your organization. So of course, from the left bottom, a developer would make a code change. In this particular case, we have a trivia app where we make a code change, it goes and builds a Docker image and pushes it to an ACR, for instance. And from there, now that we've pushed a new Docker image, we have a new build number, we update some metadata in a repository that links to this newly published Docker image. And updating that metadata requires a PR approval. And that PR approval will also let you see what changes that will make to your YAML. And once that's approved, then we actually go and transform that metadata YAML into your full blown out YAML that actually is what gets pulled onto your cluster via GitOps. And from there, a tool like Flux, or if you use a different syncing agent, can go and pull from the cluster or from the repository and install on your cluster on a per environment basis. And of course, a lot of this metadata updates and everything that can all happen on a per environment basis under the hood using things like Helm. You can easily do multiple environments, and that's, I'll say, a typical Bedrock GitOps flow. So we did the work for GitOps over several sort of workings with customers and just kind of learning. And we kind of rolled this all up into, I'll say a CLI, which, well, actually two CLIs. One is called Bedrock, and there's the Bedrock setup command that basically will go and sort of lay all these things out for you. And then there is another tool called Fabricate, which is kind of an optional tool, but that one is all concerned about allowing you to look at higher level abstractions of your microservice definitions. And so you can think of it as a layer on top of Helm. It kind of serves a similar purpose to things like, so to like customize. However, there are some differences. And then also we have this Bedrock inits and deployment commands, which sort of give you some of the observability that we'll talk about in a while. But that's kind of a background on Bedrock. And next, I think Samia will take over talking about what we've done with Spectate.
Thanks, Andre. So let's look at our solution for GitOps observability. Spectate is a React-based observability tool that captures data from all your CI/CD pipelines in the GitOps process in a storage table to give a high-level view of the process before changes are pushed into the cluster. So it captures things like who is the author, what was the code change in the microservice, what deployment ring is this associated with, is the PR to deploy this change open? If not, who approved it? What changes were associated with HLD for this change? Is Flux synced on this most recent deployment? A lot of these questions that come in before something makes into the cluster are answered by Spectate. So I think to understand more, I'll dive into a quick live demo of this one. I'll take the screen away. So if you can see my screen, you'll see a live Spectate dashboard. I'll go through the different components of the screen. So this basically gives you a tabular view of all the deployments that have happened recently in descending order. So we have a few things here. It tells you the name of the microservice. Right now I'm using the Trivia app, and I'll go through that in a bit, but there's two microservices, backend and frontend. It has deployment rings. Right now we're only using dev, but you can expect to see master, staging, so on. It gives you the name of the author who initiated these deployments. In this case, right now, we haven't used this example in a while, so it's just a single author. So we have three CI/CD pipelines linked here. The image creation, meta update, and the ready to deploy pipeline goes through these. Image creation is the CI pipeline for the microservices that builds the Docker image. The metadata update is the change that makes into the HLD, as Andre described in the diagram before. which opens a pull request before it can get merged into the high-level definition so that approvers can make sure that the change should go in, and then gives you the name of the person who merged it. And then lastly, we have the manifest generation pipeline, which uses Fabricate, or a tool that can convert all the your high-level definition into your Kubernetes manifest that can be deployed to the cluster. It gives you the last updated time, and right now we have a cluster synced to this Trivia app deployment, which is why it's showing up here. So I'll give a quick example of the entire Bedrock GitOps process. Because it's we don't have a lot of time, I'm gonna just go through a video. So this is what the Trivia app looks like. It's just a simple trivia getting questions from an API. To kick this off, I'm gonna make a change to the front end. So I'm gonna make a change to the title here. Let's skip ahead to that portion. So I'm just editing the code here to make it V2 version instead of V1. And once you make a change and you commit the change, Spectate starts to show you that change. Let me skip ahead to that. So here's Spectate showing most recent deployments before this change went in. And as soon as that change is pushed, we see that Docker image is being built for the front end service. We can click on the links to see what the progress looks like. So you can see here we changed it to 2.1, and the ACR image is being built. So a few things happen here before the ACR build. Spectate needs to capture some information about this this particular pipeline so that can display it. So it just quickly downloads Bedrock CLI and it pushes some information to the storage table. It's just a single line command. And it adds it to the database. And now we're just waiting for the ACR image creation to be complete. Once the image is built, the next thing to be done is the high-level definition needs to be reflecting the latest Docker image for that deployment. So update image tag is our meta update. It's the second stage in the GitOps process. So once again, this one downloads the Bedrock scripts, downloads Fabricate, a bunch of things, sends all that data to the Spectate storage. And instead of pushing this change directly to the high-level definition, it creates a pull request against the HLD. We will see that shortly. It's currently opening that PR. You can skip ahead a bit more. So once those two are done, we should start to see them in the dashboard here. And it also gives you a link to the PR that it opened. You can see that the change here was the most recent image tag that was just built. It's trying to merge that change. So we'll, for now, just approve it myself. And merging this change into the high-level definition kicks off the manifest generation pipeline, which is listening in the high-level definition repository. So we can go ahead and see that this change was reflected. And this kind of shows the structure of the whole high-level definition. You have the two microservices and the configurations for those. And here we have the tag that was just recently updated. So the Spectate dashboard now starts to reflect the final change in this deployment, which is the manifest generation. We can see that this part is in progress, and we can click ahead and see what's happening there. So this is a similar pipeline. It's downloading Bedrock scripts, updating the Spectate storage, downloading Fabricate to do generation of manifests, using Helm and all of those tools. Go ahead. Once that change is pushed into the manifest repository, we can see that this was just updated recently. Flux will be listening to this repository, and it can reflect these changes into the cluster almost instantly. So when we go back to Spectate, we can see that synced cluster now shows the ESUS cluster synced with the most recent deployment. And when we go ahead to the Trivia app, we see that V2.1 was reflected on our Trivia application that was running. That concludes the demo for Spectate. I'll give it back to Andre.
Thank you. So let's continue with this. So next, we want to talk about sort of why GitOps observability. GitOps is something that has been around for a bit. I'm sure most of you have heard of it. Probably there are many different definitions of it. But the GitOps observability is something that I think that as more and more folks get into GitOps, you see more like organizations sort of giving each one of their teams a Kubernetes cluster. I think I was reading recently that over, like from the last KubeCon, that over at Apple, that every dev team is like getting their own cluster. And so how do you sort of see things across an organization? I think that's what we'll kind of get into. And scaling from a single team to an organization. If someone is using GitOps or using Kubernetes, I'll say, if you just have one microservice, I mean, maybe Kubernetes is not the right thing for you. Usually you have, folks are running multiple things. They have a real microservice architecture. And in terms of observability, you want to be able to see everything that's going on. Like your software isn't working in a silo. It's often working in conjunction with other things. And so making sure that it can scale from, and if you're working with multiple teams, these other teams, of course, are going to have their own mini ecosystems. And so we want to make sure that these things can scale from one team to many, and you can actually see what's going on. And this is very important for different people in your organization. You could have a team lead who wants to see something. You could have someone at a director level who may want to see something. Or if you're running at a much larger scale, you really want to be able to have hooks into what the health and pulse is of your containers journeys everywhere. Maybe you can find efficiencies and save money, especially if you're running bare metal, perhaps. In this particular example, we have this FabricCam trivia team. And of course, they're going from, as John-Z mentioned, a kind of monolith to breaking up into a microservices architecture. This is probably, in our industry, a meme at this point of folks breaking up from a monolith to a microservices architecture and doing things like that. And then from there, you can kind of see how the scaling happens of having multiple developers making a code change, multiple builds happening for Docker images and containers. Each one of those are going through a CI pipeline. Each of those are going to a container registry. It gets actually quite complicated as you get a little bit more people and more teams. Next, so some of the problems that you run into is too many microservices. I think another meme in the industry is you would see a lot of companies talking about, like Uber, about how many microservices they have. We have 652 microservices. Is that a good thing or not? That really depends upon the organization, and your mileage may vary. But if you have 600 plus microservices, imagine all the different versions you have as those things change. And of course, those are split up amongst several teams. And some of the microservices might not be well designed. Perhaps there is some tight coupling. One microservice might not work with another, which might not be the optimal thing, but teams are always evolving and software is evolving. And in a particular area, you might need to sort of have that. And of course, just lacking the observability from this entire process is tough. And another sort of pillar we think of GitOps observability is being able to support the different deployment strategies. So, some teams, like a typical thing for folks is to go and have let's say a dev test in the prod cluster. So now you have 3 clusters, and you have multiple clusters to manage to get to your prod environment. And then you have typical environment promotion. You promote from dev to test to prod. Some teams like to just have one big cluster, one high-powered cluster, and they go and sort of test in production there. They either use namespaces or they use some sort of routing. And from our experiences working with many different companies, we've seen a mix of these two types of styles. And one style that we see sometimes is with the testing in production is to do something called a ringed deployment. And so the ring deployment basically allows you to have multiple versions of the same microservice on the cluster. And of course, this can be separated. Like doing it by namespace is kind of like a soft multi-tenancy. Sometimes people like to do this using traffic-based routing. So for instance, let's say a request is coming into your cluster and you actually have a header on that request that will route it to the correct version that you want. Being able to support strategies like that, where you can start with a canary and then sort of, ramp that up from 10% of requests to, let's say, 15 and, et cetera. So this is technically a canary deployment style, but you use a different sort of way to be able to have it all on one cluster. Next, we also want to be able to, with the GitOps observability, be a little bit more predictable. As like software, if you step back and look at everything, there are patterns that emerge. You typically a build should take this amount of time. If it takes longer, or if it takes longer for you to make a change and for it to get to production, in the aggregate, you should be able to see that. And we want the same thing in this GitOps observability. When you step back and you look at your team or your organization, and they are trying to just get things to production and move things along, you want to be able to understand why is the journey for a developer to production taking so long. And suppose this example that's written here. Suppose that it's 3 a.m., the dreaded 3 a.m. call, where you have some services that are quite critical and they're not working. And you have someone up at 3 a.m. who wants to just go and roll back something or deploy something new. And they are trying to do that, and they don't really know how long this should take. Should it take just a few minutes, or should it take an hour or more? It's good to have that history of how long this usually takes. So one of the, so I think that our journey for great GitOps observability definitely has some I'll say some key points over here. The first one we think is, whatever tool this is should be portable, and portable meaning that, you can run it locally, you can run it, on the cloud, or, it should be quite lightweight. And usually these days a Docker image should suffice for that. And the lightweight means that, it should be fast and efficient. You should not have a whole bunch of, you shouldn't have to do a compilation to get this going. We've seen some frameworks where you need to actually build into the framework and then do a build in order to things like, no, that probably isn't what we think is going to be a great GitOps observability. Security, being able to, not access the cluster, because that opens up a whole bunch of things, but being able to, hopefully be able to get information in a different way, perhaps through hooks or whatever. Also, as we talked about, being scalable, being predictable, and supporting different deployment strategies, whether it's ringed or your traditional environment promotion between different physical environments. Those are all things that we kind of see as great GitOps observability. And I think that, what Samia demoed with Spectate is kind of our first step at looking towards that. Next is our sort of next steps and takeaways. I'm not sure if John Z is still on the call. Otherwise, I can take this part. So what are we doing now? So a lot of this Bedrock stuff and Spectate, we've been kind of working on it, kind of on and off. Like it's kind of our, we're not like sort of a Bedrock team. It's just something we put on open source. As we work with more customers, we contribute back to it. And so, recently, one of the things that we've been doing is we've been talking a lot with the Azure Arc team about how this sort of pattern can be leveraged for a lot of quick start things for Azure Arc customers. If you're not familiar with Azure Arc, it's there's Azure Arc for Kubernetes, excuse me, which deals with on-prem scenarios and getting people up and going. We were in talks with sort of, I'll just say the GitOps sort of open source company to see how a lot of the work that we're doing can be integrated with the work that they're doing. And I think we want to just, continue to evolve some of these patterns to keep up to date. I mean, there are things like Flux v2 and GitOps Toolkit that we are integrating in. And I think, there's some exciting things coming into the community as more and more folks are doing more and more Kubernetes deployments. It's really an interesting thing. So high level takeaway is that, what we showed here, these things are being used in companies that we've been working with here at Microsoft. And we really want to go and like reduce the amount of time it takes for folks to do deployments. I think that's also, a key principle of GitOps itself, and sort of do this in a way that just works well on AKS. Whether that means it's homegrown or we're taking it, collaborating with folks in the cloud native community. And from that, I think we'll take some Q&A from here. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, and feel free to come off mute to ask your question or put it into the chat. You can also use your hand button. And I'll start off with the question, Andre, actually. So does Bedrock have an opinionated way how you should build out kind of your Git repositories? Meaning, one of the conversations I see a lot around GitOps is, should I use a branch-based strategy versus a directory-based strategy? And those different ways I can organize my repos. So does Bedrock or anything like have an opinionated view on that, or is it up to the end user?
It's up to the end user. I think what we've seen, so with branches, I'll say that having everything in one branch and just sort of segregating by directory sort of maybe gives you the ultimate view. I'll say it's a little bit more difficult if you want to look cross-branch, like for instance, trying to look at Git histories across multiple branches. But I think the tooling obviously is flexible, especially with some of the changes in like things like Flux v2 to support both. However, yeah, I do see folks from our experience prefer having everything in one to be able to get that sort of comprehensive view. But I'm sure that there's situations where it might make sense to sort of do a branch-based model.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what I've seen is like almost a 50-50 split of customers and how they organize their directories. I think the probably biggest benefit of having it all in a single branch is those tools like Customize can work when you start doing that across branches. You start duplicating a lot of stuff at the same time. So,
yeah, exactly.
All right, what other questions do we have out there? All right. No questions at all. I want to thank. Oh, do we have one?
Yeah, I have a question. So first of all, hi everyone. Thank you for the presentation. Actually, my question is also around the Git repository, because I know, for example, for Fleet, it requires defined structure, sort of, where your YAML files will be living to get pulled later on into the cluster. So is there something similar to that about the structure of the repository? That would be my first question. And the second one, is there an integration, or the integration has been tested with Knative, for example?
I guess I'll take this. We have not tested this with Knative. I think a lot of the customers that we've worked with haven't seemed to be using Knative that much. And with your first question around the structure of the repository, yeah, with a lot of the things that we're seeing, the newer things that have been coming this year, there is a little bit more structure to repository. I think as we integrate those things in, a lot of what we've done here is based on Flux v1, which is kind of very doesn't have too many restrictions, because all it's doing is pulling YAML, as opposed to sort of having metadata about Flux within your repository. So right now, I'll say that we are actually contributing back very soon, as we're finishing up working with the customer, sort of what our opinion on that looks like soon.
I see. Thank you very much.
Andre, I also had another question for Samaya. Is Spectate dependent on using Bedrock, or could I use Spectate in conjunction if I was running like my, deploying Flux to my own cluster and using my, own GitHub repo, all of that? Or is it dependent on utilizing Bedrock?
Yeah, certainly. Actually, Spectate can be used with anything, even other than Bedrock. So just the idea here is that everything is captured in a storage table. And we are trying to support more tools here other than Azure. So we are trying to support GitHub repositories and GitLab and eventually Bitbucket and so on. So the idea is it should and it can be used outside of Bedrock as well.
Okay, awesome. Because that's one of the areas I find that has been lacking a lot of times is like observability from GitOps. There's like Argo CD does have like a UI, but I think like Spectate takes it a little further from like the things you can observe from that GitOps pipeline.
Yep.
All right. Do we have any other questions?
There was a question I saw around the CAF landing zone of Bedrock. And so I think that's referring to sort of Terraform. I'll say that the CAF landing zone is something that we are that we've known about. And I think if someone's starting from scratch, especially with just Terraform stuff, I would look into the CAF landing zones. I think what we have done with Bedrock is, really more about GitOps rather than Terraform. So, and one of the great things about what we've done is that it is sort of very modular. So you don't have to use any of our Terraform at all. In fact, that is probably just for people that are starting from scratch. And most people are not starting from scratch. So yeah, definitely look into the CAF landing zones as well. If you are starting from scratch and you just want something simple, feel free to look at our Terraform. But also if you have a on-premise situation, yeah, look at things like Azure Arc for Kubernetes as well. So I just wanted to answer that question. I just saw it now.
Yeah, thank you for that. One reason we were looking at landing zones, the Terraform ones, was its integration with Rover. So it makes it easier to use in pipelines and GitHub Actions and such. So are there any specific examples of how to use Bedrock with GitHub Actions or DevOps pipelines?
Yeah, I can take this one. We do have an example of GitHub Actions, and we are currently in the process of completing the support for GitHub Actions. So the support is in. We just need to complete some of the documentation. I'll drop a link to sample Spectate dashboard. I just need to quickly look for it.
Thank you.
All right. If we don't have any more questions on around Bedrock and GitOps, we can open it up for, it looks like we have about 7 minutes left. Any questions in general that you have on AKS, new features? Really, this part is open to any questions you have at all. No questions at all. Quiet crowd today. Well, if there is no questions, as always, you can always reach out to us. Either, if you want to send us an email to aksofficers@microsoft.com, or reach out to myself or Kendall individually, that's also fine. We are always looking for speakers. If you want to talk about what you're doing with Kubernetes, really, we're open to a lot of different topics. So feel free to reach out if you have topic suggestions that you would like to see. Also, you can always put those in the chat. You can reach out to us directly on things you would like to see. We want to make the call as valuable as we can for the audience. So we highly suggest making suggestions on these different topics you would like us to cover. With that, thanks for everybody for joining. Special thanks to our speakers also for taking the time out of the day to come talk about Bedrock and GitOps. And with that, have a good rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thank you.